Roughly a year ago, or maybe 2 years ago, or sometime in the last 23 years of my vacuous existence, I went into a pawn shop, which I don't normally do, since the markup tends to be pretty high, so you're unlikely to get a good deal on anything. And beyond that, the owners of pawn shops are often inordinately disagreeable. But for whatever reason, I went into this pawn shop, and I'm glad I did, because I found something truly amazing. I was scanning across their DVDs and Blu-rays, which were all the usual crap, until one caught my attention, a spine that simply said, "The Dancing Pumpkin," which sounded interesting, so I pulled it off the shelf, looked at the cover, and thought, yeah, I'm losing money not buying this. I mean, look at it. It's magnificent. Why, it's the pick of the patch. Apparently, it's award-winning family entertainment, a Telly Award specifically, which I had never heard of until I looked it up after seeing this. According to their website, they honor excellence in video and television across all screens, which, though it doesn't say what category it won, is a good sign. Here we get our first look at the titular fruit, as well as a group of children who he presumably ropes into his pumpkin-y escapade. This is where it becomes apparent that the movie is computer-generated, and judging by these images, it's fairly old, which is part of why I was interested. For some reason, I really love old CG, particularly from throughout the 80s and even into the 70s. In many ways, I find CG from that era more interesting than modern bleeding-edge CG, the reason being that it's not a new frontier anymore. It's a well-understood, well-matured field with essentially no limitations. You go back 30 to 40 years, and it was uncharted territory. Everyone had to come up with creative ways to work around substantial limitations. Often it is the limitations that make something interesting, and with CG, those are getting smaller by the day, which makes it kind of boring. Some good collections of old CG would be the Mind's Eye series. I have 2 of the 4 main entries, Beyond the Mind's Eye from 1992, and The Gate to the Mind's Eye from 94. These don't have an overarching story or even narration. They're just montages of CG shorts from various artists set to continuous music. They're worth checking out if you're into that kind of thing. There's also Lensman, an anime movie from 1984 based on a series of books, which is predominantly traditional animation but with occasional 3D CG elements. And it has a fantastic opening. Unfortunately, the Dancing Pumpkin isn't anywhere near that old, but it's definitely not brand new, and was presumably made on a very low budget, so it should still be pretty interesting on a technical level. So, even just looking at the front cover, I was already sold on this movie. But then I read the back, and was never the same. The thrilling tale of the tap-dancing pumpkin. That's right, he doesn't just dance, he tap-dances. One magical night, 4 children discover that the jack-o'-lantern on their doorstep is alive, and a brilliant tap dancer. The children befriend the charismatic pumpkin and set out on a thrilling adventure to stop the evil ogre Finkgrinder from his mission to hurt people. I love how preposterously blunt that is. Giant royal thunderbelly pumpkins, weighing over 500 pounds, carry the children to the ogre's castle. I suppose they mention the weight here to give us some idea of how impressively large they are, but that would be entirely density dependent. Despite weighing over 500 pounds, they could still be either quite large or quite small, so this extraneous detail is too incomplete to help us envision properly their full scale. Along the way, they are menaced by witches and helped by 2 comical skeletons named Helgi and Finnbogi. In a dramatic finale, the Dancing Pumpkin and his friends succeed in foiling Finkgrinder's plans. Kind of gives away the ending. I mean, I didn't expect them to fail miserably and die in a kids' movie, but nonetheless. Packed with adventure, thrills, and unforgettable characters, this winning production will entertain the entire family. By the sound of things, this might be the best $1 I've ever spent, and it even includes 3 bonus cartoons for added value. Looking at the tech specs, we can see that it's not region encoded, which is always nice, as nothing should be. It's also in color, which isn't terribly surprising. It's only stereo, which is a shame, and at 70 minutes, it's not even feature length. It's in 4:3, which is disappointing, since 4:3 is so wretchedly boring that, frankly, it should be illegal. And 4:3 seems very outdated for a copyright of 2006. To put that in perspective, 2006 is the year Blu-ray was released. It was also the year the Hyperscan was released. Just thought that was worth mentioning. And it's written by someone named Howard Butcher. Insert predictable joke about how he butchered the script. The address for the distribution company, Timeless Media Group, is in Eugene, Oregon, which is only a couple hours' drive from where I live, so in the grand scheme of things, I guess you could consider that local, which might explain how this ended up in a small pawn shop in a small town. The movie opens with a fairly typical fairy tale-style narration over shots of nighttime scenery.
It is a magical time when the leaves on the trees transform themselves to brilliant colors.
This is where it immediately becomes apparent that the exposure and contrast is severely problematic. The black level is consistently off, and there are many shots that are far too dark, with heavily clipped shadows. This isn't a mistake I made editing this video. The movie actually looks like this. For example, let's take a look at the very first shot in the movie. It's night, so this shot should be dark, but here you can see the foreground is completely underexposed, to the point that you can barely make out any grass. Because the shadows have been clipped here, that detail is just gone. It's mostly a void of nothing. The same can be seen in the background, where tree trunks have no detail, but are instead a weird hole in the image where all detail has been lost. So you can tell there's a tree there, not because you can see it, but because you can see the void where it should be. The red mushrooms awkwardly stand out against this void like they're just pasted on top of it. And look at the fence in this shot. It juts out against the blotchy, murky background, and the red color bleeds strangely. Unfortunately, this isn't just in a few isolated shots. This look is pervasive throughout the movie. It looks a bit like the master was a higher bit depth and they didn't convert it properly, but I think it's unlikely this was made at a high bit depth. So now the question is, was this problem in the original render? Or is this a new problem created while mastering the DVD? In other words, if we had access to the master files, would they look like this? I doubt it. I'm going to assume this happened during the DVD transfer. The DVD even starts with a disclaimer from Daystar that reads, "This program has been reproduced from carefully selected archival films. State-of-the-art technology has been used to present the highest quality production. However, some imperfections in image and sound quality are unavoidable." Which may or may not be an admission of guilt. But, back to the opening narration, another thing you may notice is that the audio quality is extremely low.
Come Halloween, all the children rush to pumpkin patches.
Like the exposure, this problem persists throughout the movie, and I suspect it is also mostly part of the DVD transfer. And you can hear his voice slam into the compressor, or more specifically probably a limiter, when he says, "cool, crisp."
Cool, crisp air.
You can even see this on a spectrogram of the movie's audio. The top and bottom here are the left and right stereo channels, the horizontal is time, the vertical is frequency, and the brightness indicates volume, with black being silence. See those short, darker spots? That's where his voice got too loud, so the limiter had to kick in and reduce the volume for a moment. Then you can see it quickly goes back to full brightness after the compressor releases. This creates an audible pumping of the volume.
Cool, crisp air.
But I'm getting carried away. Maybe we should talk about the actual movie. The opening narration is short and to the point. He explains that it's the Halloween season where people put jack-o'-lanterns on their doorsteps. But there's something more to the pumpkins than people realize.
Until the night of the dancing pumpkin.
Did you hear that dog bark? I'm pretty sure that's a stock sound effect since it's familiar to me, like I've heard it in other things.
Dancing pumpkin.
Well, why use a stock sound for something as easy to record as a dog? I guarantee you know at least one person who owns a dog. So just ask him if you can record it. Or if you're that desperate, here's one of mine you can have for free. It's actually multiple dogs, but there are parts where it's only one at a time. Links in the description if you want it. It's dogs barking. Immediately after the narration, we get our first instance of tap dancing, a mere 53 seconds in, though we don't yet see the pumpkin himself. His dancing awakens some children who go outside to investigate. This is odd for a few reasons. To begin with, when I was a kid, if I heard a weird sound outside in the middle of the night, the last thing I would do is run out into the dark to investigate. And beyond that, Would tap dancing really be loud enough to wake them up, especially after being attenuated by at least one, but probably multiple walls? Turns out it was even loud enough to wake up the neighbor kids who run over to see what caused it. And we hear that same dog sound effect again.
Did you see anything? No, I didn't see anything. Someone moved our pumpkin out of place.
This instantly catches his eye, but it's not blatantly disturbed. It's only slightly farther from the wall than it was. How obsessive is this kid to notice that quickly? Even though they haven't found anything strange, aside from a moderately displaced pumpkin, and should probably just go back to sleep, they instead decide to investigate further behind the house.
Let's check out the back of your house.
I'm not going to bother talking much about how the voice acting for the kids isn't that great, because there just isn't that much to say, and there's already quite a lot of other things to talk about. Wait, so the tap dancing was enough to wake them up through multiple walls, but they don't hear the loud-ass witch cackle while they're already awake and outside? Regardless, the pumpkin that was moved out of place springs to life as our main character.
I see you up there.
And we officially have a dancing pumpkin, an astonishing 1 minute 47 seconds in. This movie wastes no time getting going. They said we'd have a dancing pumpkin, and we do, in less than 2 minutes. This is where I'd like to talk some more about the technical aspects. The exposure and low audio quality continue to be a problem, though an additional note on the sound would be that the music here is basically mono. You can see the sound field here is just a straight centered line, like it would be if it was mono. There is some very slight variance in the channels, but it's effectively mono, and this is true of all the audio in the movie. A wider stereo field would look and sound like this. Not a huge problem, but a wider sound field is always more interesting to listen to. In terms of the animation, I'm not going to be terribly harsh. It does generally look robotic and deliberate, and this is caused by too large a percentage of the in-between frames being interpolated by the computer, as opposed to handmade by a human. Interpolation is a process where intermediate pieces of information are approximated from existing, surrounding information. I use this process all the time in audio repair. I can remove an unwanted sound from a recording by simply muting it, but that would leave a hole of silence, which in certain situations can be audible. Using interpolation, that hole can be filled in by using surrounding information to approximate the intermediate information that would be there if the unwanted sound wasn't. In any digital camera that uses a Bayer array as its image sensor, which would include the overwhelming majority of all digital cameras ever made, including this one, a large portion of the information in the frame is interpolated rather than actually recorded by the camera. In computer animation, interpolation is used to generate the extra frames between the handmade keyframes. This way, a lot of the work can be done automatically by the computer, saving a huge amount of time. The problem is that if you use too much of it, it starts to look robotic, since the interpolation is purely mathematical, as opposed to designed by a human. This can be mitigated somewhat by ramping in and out of keyframes so the in-betweens aren't perfectly linear, but ideally you want to use the least amount of interpolation possible. But animation is an unfathomably time-consuming process, so it's to be expected that a production on this level of budget would have sparse keyframes. It would look a lot better if there were far more handmade frames to lower the overall amount of interpolation, but that would quickly make the production astronomically more complex, and thus expensive. So complaining that this movie isn't on par with a Pixar movie of the same age is pointless. The money just isn't there. There's also occasional clipping visible, like into the jack-o'-lantern here and their ears in this shot. This isn't terribly egregious, as it doesn't totally ruin the shots, but it's easily fixable by slightly repositioning the objects. You might wonder why I'm going easy on the animation when I've already complained about things like the exposure, the narrator's voice audibly hitting the compressor, and the stock dog bark. But those are basic, fundamental aspects of a production. It doesn't cost more money to have a recording not hit the compressor. You can record dogs for free, and a correctly exposed shot doesn't cost any more money than an incorrectly exposed one. Especially when it's computer generated and you can put the lighting and brightness anywhere you want without having to work around real-world limitations. For example, I have to stop this lens down from f2 to f4 in order to get even remotely usable sharpness, since it's a vintage lens that wasn't high-end even at the time, and this can make getting correct exposure in certain situations more difficult. Problems like that don't exist in a computer. Adding more handmade keyframes to the animation, however, isn't free. It would exponentially increase the workload for the animation team that's so small I can fit the entire list on screen without it scrolling. And wouldn't it be great if Ben Lipman here did the lip sync? I'd also like to talk about the design of the characters. In my opinion, the overall style is too middle of the road. It's not stylized enough to be truly stylized, but it's not realistic enough to be truly realistic. The perfect example of this is the dancing pumpkin himself. Sure, he's stylized since, well, he's an anthropomorphic pumpkin, but his pumpkininess isn't played up. Yes, he's a pumpkin and he has vines instead of limbs, but those vines end in gloves and shoes, which is a little too human. Shouldn't they just be vines? They could end in leaves or something to that effect, but no, he has gloves and shoes. I realize you would need shoes in order to tap dance, but you could just have him not tap dance. Because here's the thing, although the back of the box says he's a brilliant tap dancer, he does almost no tap dancing, aside from the little at the beginning that wakes up the children. He dances a lot in this movie, but almost none of it is tap dancing. And it's not even in the title. Moving to his face, his mouth is the jack-o'-lantern cutout, but instead of his teeth being part of that cutout, the way many people cut their jack-o'-lanterns, he has actual teeth, as in enameled bone teeth, like a person, which I find very off-putting. And his nose cutout doesn't go all the way through, which looks weird. He has eyeballs too, but I'll grant that if he didn't, and his eyes were just cutouts in the pumpkin, it might be kinda creepy. Of course, you could still deform the cutouts like eyelids for expression, which they already do, but even so, it would likely require some really good animation in order not to be creepy. So maybe eyeballs were necessary? Or maybe these are all reasons that making a movie about an anthropomorphic pumpkin is just conceptually a bad idea. And the animation doesn't play up the fact that he's a large chunk of weight suspended on soft, flexible vine. Instead of bobbling around from this strange top-heavy balance, which would look really cool, his vines effortlessly hold him up like normal legs with bones would, which is just another way he's too human. The style problem also extends to the kids. Their body proportions are somewhat realistic, but then you slap a massively oversized head on it and it looks really weird. But I'm getting carried away again. We're only 2 minutes into this movie. The pumpkin realizes that he's being watched as the kids have come back to the front of the house.
Oh my, I've been caught red-handed, vines and all. My dancing has gotten me in trouble, but I love it so much I can't help it. Salutations.
Hello, Mr. Pumpkin.
Look at the balls on this one. She's just witnessed a sentient pumpkin dancing on her doorstep, and she doesn't have any qualms about this, but instead simply greets him as if that's an entirely unremarkable occurrence. Though, understandably, she is bothered that he knows her name.
Are you friendly?
Certainly I am, Heather.
How do you know my name?
I know all your names. You're Chris. You're Nicholas. You're Joyce. After all, you picked me from the pumpkin patch and brought me here.
Why would he know their names just because they picked him? Maybe he just overheard them talking, and they all just happened to say each other's names at least once?
Now it's my duty to guard your house.
What are you guarding the house from?
Well, that's a secret.
This is the point where I started to become distracted by how he kinda sounds like Seth Green.
You're a very good dancer, Mr. Pumpkin.
Do you really think so?
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's very nice of you to say that.
Why don't other pumpkins move and dance like you?
Pumpkins are shy. They embarrass very easily and prefer to sit quietly out of the way. You see, my young friends, I'm an uncommon pumpkin.
That is one of my favorite lines I've ever heard in a movie.
We won't tell anyone if you tell us what you're guarding the house from.
That's supposed to be a secret. One secret leads to another, and then to another, and before you know it, they'll take away my dancing shoes and I'll be pumpkin pie before my time.
Can we take a moment to acknowledge the fact that he just implied there's a higher power that goes around executing pumpkins that reveal the secret? Well, brace yourself for a plot dump.
Listen carefully now. In the monster world, the more scary you are, the more important you are. All the monsters want to be important, so they try to scare people on Halloween night.
Why haven't we seen any monsters before?
Ah, but you have. When you go out trick-or-treating, you see monsters. You think they are all youngsters like you in costumes, but some of them are real monsters.
Wow!
Once again, she is incredibly unsurprised by something that should be shocking. I do find this idea genuinely interesting, that there are real monsters mixed in with the costumed people on Halloween night. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't do a thing with this interesting idea. At no point do we see monsters mixed in with trick-or-treaters, or anything of the sort.
Why do pumpkins protect houses?
It's our sworn duty. Halloween monsters try to sneak up on houses because they know people live in them. It's the pumpkin's job to keep them away.
Again, I find this idea genuinely interesting. The concept that the seemingly unassuming jack-o'-lanterns around houses are actually silent sentinels secretly keeping people safe from monsters. Not for fame or personal gain, but because they swore an oath, and the people don't even realize this is going on. You could tell an interesting story about that. Unfortunately, the movie doesn't do a thing with this interesting idea. Although we see other pumpkins, none of them are ever shown in a protective role, and we never see any other people besides the kids. It's not like there's a scene where we see a group of monsters plotting to terrorize some trick-or-treaters, or planning an assault on a house that gets thwarted by pumpkins, or anything of the sort. The movie establishes this interesting dynamic, and then completely forgets about it. And those drawings could be cut out a little better.
If a monster is bitten twice by pumpkins on the same night, it will shrink down to the size of a pumpkin seed and spend the rest of its life hiding under mushrooms being chased by hungry birds.
Even that, as bizarre as it is interesting. Why would a pumpkin bite shrink monsters? And why does it have to be 2 bites instead of just 1? I have no idea, but I never would have guessed something like that would be in this movie, so that alone makes it interesting. Though it does come across as an incredibly obvious setup for how they're going to take care of the bad guy at the end. While I think that this whole concept of pumpkins as protectors is intriguing, it does start to make less sense the more you think about it. It's a bit like fiat money and patriotism that way. Like, when does their life begin? Is it when the plant grows? Or is it when they're picked from the patch and magically learn people's names? Or is it when they're specifically carved into a jack-o'-lantern and placed by the front door? Later in the movie, he says, "all my life."
I've been practicing all my life.
Is that just the couple days max it's been since he was picked? Or is he a timeless curse, and this particular pumpkin is just his current vessel? And what about a couple days after Halloween, when the pumpkin gets all mushy and knackered and you throw it out? Are they dead? Do they live on in the seeds and become new pumpkins? Or do they just return to their eldritch dimension and reincarnate into a different pumpkin next year? I realize I'm not supposed to think about these things, but all I'm asking for is one throwaway line that quickly explains it.
Are there any dangerous monsters?
Are there any monsters that aren't dangerous? If they weren't dangerous, would they even be called monsters?
Are there any dangerous monsters?
Yes,
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
there is an ogre, an enemy of life.
The absolute sincerity with which he says, "enemy of life," amuses me greatly. Though, isn't he alive too? He's an ogre, not a specter.
An enemy of life.
Enemy of Cocoon.
He is planning to have a monster clinic to show monsters how to hurt people again.
Wait, again? Did we establish that monsters have forgotten how to hurt people? He just said that in the monster world, the scarier you are, the more important you are. I realize scaring and hurting are 2 very different things, but he said nothing of monsters not knowing how to hurt people anymore.
This is one of his announcements. Monster clinic at Finkgrinder, the ogre's castle.
He just had that in his hat the whole time? I mean, okay, the movie needs to keep moving, but where did Finkgrinder distribute these flyers that the dancing pumpkin could intercept one?
The night before Halloween.
Apparently, Finkgrinder forgot to double-check it after he whipped it up in Microsoft Publisher. He accidentally put 2 spaces after art, though the little clip art of a medieval flail is adorable. And as a side note, whether or not that particular type of flail was even used in medieval combat is debated. The movie cuts to a dank castle dungeon, where the clipped shadows are particularly appalling, and a cloaked figure is digging for something.
the Book of Hurts.
I do love how spectacularly blunt that book title is. It could have been The Tome of Turpitude, or The Odious Ogre's Guide to Oppression, or The Ne'er-do-well's Pamphlet of Pernicious Practices, or even Cruelty and Concomitant Concerns. But instead, it's just Book of Hurt. Brilliant.
From here on, Halloween monsters will hurt people. I'm gonna take the happy out of Halloween.
Maybe it's just because he's hard to see through the massively clipped black, but for some reason Fink Grinder here kinda reminds me of Kane from the Legacy of Kane series.
Destiny is a game, is it not?
That's debatable.
How can we stop him?
Travel to his castle and face him. If we can drag him into the sun, he turns into skunk cabbage.
I'll help you.
I must warn you, it will be very dangerous.
If it's dangerous, why would you allow the children to come along, even if they wanted to? That's just a bit antithetical to it being his sworn duty to protect people.
Are you sure?
Yes.
I'll help.
Me too.
Count me in also.
If you are sure, tomorrow night when the moon rises, meet me on the doorstep.
Why does he take it upon himself to take out Fink Grinder? It's not like he's the leader of the pumpkins or the only one that's a protector. He explains it like all pumpkins everywhere are protectors.
Why do pumpkins protect houses?
It's our sworn duty.
But instead of teaming up with other pumpkins, or the Pumpkin King dispatching the pumpkin equivalent of SEAL Team 6, this guy just abandons his post after revealing the secret he was supposed to keep to set out on his own personal mission of vengeance. But why him specifically? He's just one of many. Or is it okay that he abandons his post because there's other pumpkins by the door? Ones that didn't completely screw up and reveal the secret. Those pumpkins are doing their job much better than the main character, who was so busy showboating he ruined the entire secret. And he's flagrantly endangering children by allowing them to accompany him. Honestly, the dancing pumpkin is pretty bad at his job.
Tomorrow night when the moon rises, meet me on the doorstep.
And none of this woke up their parents?
It's time to go.
Chris,
What?
this morning in the library, I looked up the word ogre in the dictionary.
What did it say?
Fictional creature?
The dancing pumpkin thinks we could stop an ogre?
We can if we expose him to sunlight.
It's frightening just thinking about it.
Then maybe you shouldn't go. I mean, you don't have to. No one's forcing you to. While waiting for the dancing pumpkin, they discuss the provisions they'll be taking along.
I brought my slingshot with some golf balls.
Okay, a weapon. Makes sense.
I brought some fudge I made with my mom.
Fudge. Makes less sense, but you might want something to eat, so alright.
I brought a jar of holy water. I got it from my church.
Holy water? Does his church just leave holy water lying around in scuttlebutts and he pilfered some? Or did he actually tell some church staff that a dancing pumpkin was taking him on a quest to stop an evil ogre? And they were like, just a moment! Take this. It's really powerful. Especially against unholy things.
I brought one of my mother's sunflowers.
Why would you bring a sunflower? So the dancing pumpkin wakes up and asks if they still want to help. They're eager to get going, but he explains they'll have to wait for the Thunderbellies.
Not yet. The Thunderbellies haven't arrived.
Thunderbellies?
Here they are now. They're members of the royal family. 500 pounds or bigger.
Man, they really want to hammer in that they weigh 500 pounds. So a regular pumpkin tap dancing wakes them up, but 2,000 pounds of Thunderbelly stomping around doesn't arouse any suspicion at all? And they don't start walking until after the shot has already started. And there's this shot here that holds frozen for a moment because they cut too early.
Climb inside. We have a long way to go to Fink Grinder's castle.
When the back of the box said the Thunderbellies carry them, I didn't think it meant internally.
What's wrong? Don't you want to be inside me?
Nestled inside the Thunderbellies, did I mention they weigh 500 pounds? They begin their journey, armed to the teeth with random knickknacks. But it's been a few minutes since there's been some dancing, so as soon as there's a suitable stump, the pumpkin can't help himself.
A practice stage. Just a second.
But aren't they on an important mission? Do they really have time to stand around while he amuses himself? You need help, Mr. Pumpkin. You have a problem. The animation style is noticeably different here. In the first scene, the motion is very slow and deliberate, and here it's suddenly snappier and more expressive. He tells the kids that he wants to win the dance contest at the pumpkin ball, but doesn't bother to explain what that is.
Pumpkin ball?
Yes, let's get going. We have a long way to go to the pumpkin ball, and even further to go to get to Finkgrinder's castle.
On their way to the pumpkin ball, since that's apparently more important than stopping Finkgrinder's evil plans, they are accosted by witches.
Thunderbellies! Thunderbellies! This is going to be good.
The witches chase them around a bit. One gets her dentures violently knocked out, then eats them. And then they capture a Thunderbelly, with Chris still inside. That's the exact same cackle they used at the beginning of the movie.
This is terrible. I have to get help at the pumpkin ball. Are you all right?
Yes.
Let's get going.
And that's the exact same "let's get going" they used back at the stump.
Let's get going.
Suddenly,
You're Nicholas.
Nicholas notices that Chris and the Thunderbelly are missing, since the dancing pumpkin oddly decided not to mention that.
Where's Chris and the other Thunderbelly?
He and the Thunderbelly have been captured by the witches.
Oh no! What will the witches do?
Who can say? Maybe they'll sell him to Finkgrinder.
Apparently, the dancing pumpkin isn't the least bit bothered that the child he was supposed to protect has been captured. Instead of saying, "We're gonna get help and rescue him," it's, maybe they'll sell him to the massively evil ogre. Whatever.
Then Finkgrinder will have him for dinner.
Nicholas doesn't care either. Holy shit! Your friend's been captured by witches, and the pumpkin suggested they might sell him to the evil man-eating ogre, and your response is, "Yeah, he's probably gonna get eaten." You're not the least bit bothered your friend might die? At least Heather actually has a response, so I guess one person cares what happens to Chris.
But sadly, it's definitely curtains for the Thunderbelly. I'm sure they'll break him up for their spells.
The dancing pumpkin doesn't hold out any hope that that Thunderbelly will make it out alive. It's not clear if the Thunderbellies are fully sapient, but they are clearly intelligent creatures to some degree, since they wave when greeted and the doomed one knew to run for its life. He even mentioned they're part of the royal family, but when one of them gets captured, all the sympathy he can muster is,
"What a shame. He was a good Thunderbelly. What a rotten way to die."
I think we can save Chris, though.
"Oh, good. You think you can save Chris. Nice."
Let's save them both.
Heather continues to be the only one with a heart. The narrator then explains that the dancing pumpkin seeks help from the Lord of the Thunderbellies, who just happens to be at the pumpkin ball. Look at the exposure in that shot. That's incredible. And even though their friend is on the fast track to being eaten, they can still appreciate the splendor of the pumpkin ball. So that's nice.
Salutations, Rotundra, Lord of the Thunderbellies.
I do like the name Rotundra for a giant pumpkin. That's pretty good. They ask him for help saving Chris and the Thunderbelly, but we don't get an answer yet.
We have to save them.
Meanwhile, in hell, the witches brutally tear that poor Thunderbelly in half, but it's okay, since nobody but Heather really cared that he got captured.
In the hundreds of years I've made dark magic, I've never found a boy inside a Thunderbelly pumpkin.
We get another instance of that witch getting her dentures violently knocked out, then eating them.
No, no, no! We can't have him for supper. I'll marry him and make him a warlock.
But I must have him for dinner!
Get your claws off! He's mine!
This whole scene just blows my mind. It starts with a violent murder and ends with a witch forcing a kid to marry her.
But I need to know, darling, will you marry me? Or do you want to be served for supper?
I'd rather marry you.
I just knew you'd say that.
Sure, given the ultimatum of marry her or be eaten, I suppose marrying her is the better choice? But what a bizarre thing to include in a kid's movie. The movie returns to the pumpkin ball, but before we can get an answer out of Rotundra, this haggard-looking pumpkin announces that it's time for the dance contest. A couple notes about the sound here. Why does his voice get louder when we get close to him?
My fellow pumpkins, good evening!
He's speaking into a mic, and his voice is clearly being amplified, so he should be just as audible from a distance. And the feedback squeal for the mic is this weird whistle chirp instead of real feedback for some reason.
Right.
There's not a lot to say here, since this is where the movie pulls the drag chute. The next 4.5 minutes or so is just a montage of pumpkins dancing various archetypical dances, culminating with the dancing pumpkin himself, whose name seems devalued now. This goes on for what feels like an eternity, and I don't find it particularly amusing, but I do not partake in the inanity of dancing, so maybe that's my fault.
When is it your turn to dance?
I'm last.
'Cause I'm the best.
Oh boy, time for us to dance.
No, not yet, my little friend.
There's a horrifying moment where one of the pumpkins is doing what I believe is supposed to be a seductive dance, complete with feather boa and full tart makeup, which doesn't bear thinking about. There's a weird line where Joyce says, "They're all so good,"
They're all so good.
even though they all facepalmed at one just moments earlier.
How many dances will there be?
Maybe 100.
I'm repeating myself here, but do they really have time to watch 100 dancers? Think Grinder's ass isn't gonna kick itself.
Is it my turn? Is it my turn?
Patience. You'll get your chance soon.
I find the way he smacks that little pumpkin on the ass a little unsavory.
Yeah. Run along, you little scamp.
Finally, it's the dancing pumpkin's turn. He does his usual shtick, and everybody loves it.
It is clear, sir, that you have earned this year's blue ribbon as the finest dancer.
Thank you!
And because he's the protagonist, he's automatically the best. Just once in a movie like this, I'd like to see the protagonist take second, or not even place at all. In real life, no matter how good you are, there's always someone that's better than you. After that ridiculous interruption of their quest, they return to Rotundra, who I guess never answered their question earlier.
Ask him about your brother. He's as old as the earth and knows everything.
How can we find my brother?
You cannot.
Will we ever see Chris again?
Yes, he will find you.
Can we stop, Think Grinder?
Maybe.
He's as old as the earth and knows everything.
Maybe.
Not terribly useful information, but at least they know Chris is alright, and will find his way back to them. But that Thunderbelly is still very dead. He gives the usual speech about looking inside oneself and being brave, and that he can't help them because it's their destiny, not his, etc.
Be careful, friends.
We return to Chris and the Witch for the weirdest scene in the movie. You see, they're married now, but there's a very strange detail here.
And now that Isurus has married us, we have only 3 hours to wait until our marriage is binding.
We're not legally married?
Not for 3 hours.
Why would the marriage not be binding for 3 more hours? I've never heard of this. Now, I'm no expert on the subject. I'm not married. But I know people who are, and I'm aware of the concept. I've even been to a wedding. No, not that one. Yeah, see? And to my knowledge, this 3-hour delay isn't a thing. It's my understanding that as soon as the person doing the marrying says, "I now pronounce you man and wife," that's it, you're married. It's a done deal. That's why he says that. He doesn't say, "I now pronounce you man and wife, but you're not actually married for 3 more hours, so watch your ass." Why then does this movie feel the need not only to mention this, but stress it?
3 hours to wait, not for 3 hours.
In 3 hours, I'll be legally married to her.
It's entirely possible they realized that it was pretty horrifying that this witch is marrying a child, so they threw in this 3-hour moratorium on consummation in an attempt to avoid the insalubrity of it all. But ultimately it doesn't make it any less uncomfortable or creepy. No, they're not actually married for 3 more hours, so it's okay. Not really? Just because it's not legally binding yet doesn't change the fact that you opened that door. The witch, Gingly, gives him the grand tour of her spell room, which just means she points out her spell book and tatty furniture. More interestingly, though, she shows him the box she keeps her flying snake in.
Can you imagine? He doesn't like witches.
You don't say.
He's tried to escape every time I've let him loose from his box.
Sounds like he just doesn't like being in your box. And how do you prevent a flying snake from escaping? One would presume he can fly, probably quite fast. So once he takes off, how do you catch up? I guess she could chase him down on her broom? In fact, that'd make a pretty good scene in the movie. It could be like the speeder bike chase from Return of the Jedi, except it'd be a flying snake and a witch on a broom zipping through trees. That'd be awesome.
Can I see him?
Ah, you can have him for all I care. He's useless to me.
If you don't care about him, why have you bothered to keep him all this time? Just let him escape.
Hello, I'm Ponce de Leon, the flying snake.
Why he's named after a conquistador, I have no idea, but the name kind of works.
Hi, I'm Chris.
I love that Chris immediately notices that Ponce has held up his tail, immediately and correctly interprets this action as analogous to an offered handshake, then, without hesitation, shakes hands with the snake's tail.
Will you lock me in the box and try to force me to scare people?
No.
Then we'll be friends.
That was easy. But to be fair, the snake's probably desperate. Ponce then tells Chris that the witch is evil, as if this is somehow a revelation.
Gingley's already had 23 husbands.
What happened to her other husbands?
She bores of them, monsieur.
How did Gingley not hear that? She's only a few feet away. Gingley demands that Chris get her some food from the cauldron, and Ponce has an idea.
Chris, this is your chance. All these years I've wanted to pour a jar of sleeping powder in her soup, but I couldn't. I have no arms.
Well, that would be a problem. But if he had to, couldn't he just wrap his tail around the jar of sleeping powder to lift it up and pour it into the food? Especially since we've already established that he knows he can use his tail in place of a hand. And if that didn't work, couldn't he just constrict her? I don't even mean to kill her necessarily. He could just constrict her long enough to knock her out, and then leave. Either way, you're rendering her unconscious against her will, so what's the difference? And she's horribly evil anyway, so just choke the bitch out and leave.
Where is the sleeping powder?
There.
Conveniently, she keeps the lid off and a spoon at the ready. And how does she not hear them talking? She's right there. There's not even a wall between them. And now she's actually facing them, too. How can she not see Chris holding the bottle of sleeping powder?
What? I knew you'd try this.
I'm sorry.
Witches of my refined upbringing don't use spoons.
That was a proper bait and switch. Let it be known that there is at least one quality joke in this movie. Gingley immediately falls asleep, and Chris decides to throw her spellbook in the cauldron? Probably a good thing to destroy it, but surely she has most of those spells memorized by now. This causes Gingley's airborne house to evaporate, or I think that's what happens? And Chris falls into the lake below.
What happened to Gingley?
She sank straight to the bottom. She is now the witch of the lake.
Let's hurry up and leave before she wakes up.
This is where the movie introduces my favorite characters, Helgi and Finnboggy. I kinda like these guys. Their thing is that they have a friendly rivalry of sorts, where they argue about who's scarier and thus better than the other.
Look, Thick Skull, I've always been more frightening than you. I've had to work twice as hard at my job because you're so unfrightening.
The dialogue is fairly amusing, and they have the best voice acting in the movie.
These skeletons, Helgi and Finnboggy, are cuckoo.
Strange that Ponce knows who they are, despite spending so much time in a box, and they don't seem to know who he is.
If we help you put yourselves back together, may I sit by the fire to get warm?
And look at that! Little prick helps himself to their fire before they've even agreed to his terms.
How do we know whose bones are whose?
All the strong, good bones are mine.
That's a really good line. Their silly competition over who's the best, extending to arguing over who has the good bones, is kind of funny. The camera slowly moving away as Chris realizes how long this is going to take is great, but it's somewhat ruined by Ponce reminding us he has no arms.
I would help you, but I have no arms.
Mine!
When we cross this bridge, we'll have entered the Ogre's Woods. All sorts of ghosts live there, and Finkgrinder's sentries will be watching for intruders. We'd better split up.
Just like that poor Thunderbelly did.
What sort of sentries does Finkgrinder have?
Black ravens.
As opposed to pink ravens?
We'll approach the castle directly, while the Thunderbellies circle around to the back.
For the next few minutes, they wander around the woods, encountering various monsters in the most protracted example yet of the completely broken black level.
We have entered the Ogre's Woods.
Ogre's Woods? But the sign said Barren Woods. Are you sure we're going the right way? They're chased by a skeletal ghost horse, which the pumpkin decides to ride for some reason.
I can ride that horse.
Though this accomplishes nothing, since it just leaves. Then a zombie appears. His reveal is weird, since the first shot is his hand coming over a fallen tree, so you'd expect him to stand up from a lying position, but the next shot is him walking out from behind a standing tree. The sound effect for him walking is appropriately revolting, though.
A zombie!
Strange that after all the bizarre and shocking things they've seen so far, this slowly shambling, derpy zombie is the first to scare them. There are several shots in this scene where Heather's hair can be seen stretching to ridiculous length while running, in an amusing physics error. In this shot, the fog in the background suddenly draws in when the camera pans down. Shouldn't it just already be there? Or was it only set up for one specific viewing angle? After running from the zombie for a bit, even though it mostly just seems confused, not threatening, the pumpkin finally bites it twice, shrinking it down to a harmless size.
Take that.
Let's just hope the zombie virus isn't communicable to pumpkins. Or he'll start to compost, and the kids will have to put him down. Next, they encounter a banshee, which, as usual, doesn't bother them very much.
What was that?
A banshee. Let's go.
So they sit down to relax in the middle of the evil woods.
Here, you guys, have some of my mother's fudge.
Oh, thank goodness the fudge comes back into play. I was really worried they'd forgotten about it.
Oh, I think this haunted place has wilted my sunflower.
No, it's probably wilted because it's been dismembered from the rest of the plant.
Here, let them have some of this holy water.
Them? Is it a colonial organism?
My sunflower has come back to life.
That's amazing.
It is indeed amazing. Some would even call it miraculous. Turns out this kid actually got a hold of legit holy water. And why is he so amazed? He's the one that said it was holy water.
I know you're scared right now, and worried about what lies ahead.
What makes you think they're scared? The only time they appeared more than a little perturbed was with the zombie. Other than that, they've managed to stay pretty calm. He gives his pep talk about having courage and stuff, and they continue onwards, but they're spotted by one of the sentries. Looks like the Book of Hurt is a real page-turner.
Huh? You say there are children and a pumpkin in the barren woods?
I do like the look of the physics on Finkgrinder's cloak, especially compared to Heather's hair earlier. And he's got a really good voice, too.
I'll dress for dinner.
While Finkgrinder prepares himself for the eating of children, we return to the woods.
Be careful. Those thorns are venomous.
Let's go this way.
Well, that was the least obstructive obstacle I've ever seen.
It's Finkgrinder.
You don't even know what Finkgrinder looks like. Turns out it's Helgi, Finnboggy, Ponce, and Chris. And in what I find to be the most entertaining dialogue in the movie, Helgi and Finnboggy are arguing over whether or not Humpty Dumpty was pushed.
It so happens that I used to be acquainted with one of his close personal friends, and he told me Humpty Dumpty had excellent balance. So you see, an egg like that would never just fall off the wall.
The rhyme never said Humpty Dumpty was an egg. Even Ponce gets involved.
My sources say Humpty Dumpty fell.
Thrill, give us away. That's my brother.
Chris introduces everybody, and with that, it's time to assault the castle. Wait, they're just gonna walk up to the front door? And the fact that it's not locked doesn't make them suspicious?
How should we enter the castle? Try the front door.
Unsurprisingly, it's a trap. But Ponce doesn't fall, so he can go get help.
I've got to find the Thunderbellies, quickly.
We're trapped.
I have an idea.
Hey, what are you doing?
It's just as I suspected. You're both equally thick in the skull.
Well, I'm glad that's settled then.
Quick now, come apart, and we'll slide your bones through the bars.
Okay.
It's really common in animated movies and shows that whenever the characters end up behind bars, they're so far apart that they can clearly and easily go through them, but they inexplicably never do, and that's always annoyed me. This movie subverts that trope by having the bars close enough together that the kids in the pumpkin clearly can't fit through them, but they also realize they can disassemble the skeletons and put them through the bars in pieces so they can reassemble on the other side. That's pretty clever.
Hurry up and get out of here so we can get out of this cage.
Fink Grinder storms in and the pumpkin begs him to let the children go.
Why can't you let these children go and just keep me?
I love nothing but treasure and fine clothes.
If you want my treasure, let my friends go.
No, I take what I want.
Watch out!
You know, you could at least have the dancing pumpkin stand at the far end of the cage, so it makes more sense that Fink Grinder can't reach him, since, as is, it looks really silly that he just flails ineffectually around something he should easily be able to reach. Regardless, they all unload their arsenal on him. Including shoving the sunflower in his mouth, which he eats instead of spitting out. And why does the dancing pumpkin only bite once? He had him. He could just really quickly chomp twice and end the whole thing. Helgi and Finnbuggy run into the room, clad in Fink Grinder's valuables.
Nobody takes what's mine.
We haven't taken anything. We found these shiny things down the hall.
Besides, if we take off these clothes, we'd be naked.
Another good line from one of the skeletons. They kite Fink Grinder around the room a bit, and he gets exhausted very quickly. I guess sitting around being evil all day isn't very good for your health. And even though it looks like the kids, though probably not the pumpkin, could now fit through the bent bars, it makes sense they stay in the cage, since as long as Fink Grinder is in the room, they're safer inside it. The skeletons lure Fink Grinder out of the room, just in time for Ponce to arrive with the Thunderbellies. Getting nitpicky again, the brightness changes right before the camera starts panning. But even if that's two separately rendered shots stitched together, shouldn't the lighting values be saved in the project, and thus the same in both clips? The Thunderbellies free them from the cage, and the dancing pumpkin wants to finish the job. Note the throat-slitting gesture. Turns out the skeletons ran Fink Grinder around until he collapsed, so he's lying on the floor when the main characters arrive.
It was you, little girl. You poisoned me with that sunflower.
When I first watched this movie, I couldn't figure out why she brought a sunflower, or why it would poison him. But then I figured out it's because it's a sunflower. Because he's hurt by the sun. I'm ashamed I didn't get that till the end of the movie, but it's not exactly intuitive. Sunflowers don't actually contain the cleansing flame of the sun, so why would I make the association? Nonetheless, the sunflower has poisoned him, which I guess is why he got exhausted so easily.
He's been wheezing and gasping as if he were tired.
As the sun comes up, Fink Grinder grabs Heather, so the nearby Thunderbelly kicks him over onto his back while the others rip the curtains down, bathing him in sunlight.
It's over.
Ugh! The ogre's turned into skunk cabbage.
Fink Grinder's death here is surprisingly violent. I didn't even expect them to kill him, since often in kids' movies the bad guy turns good at the end. You know, the main characters help him realize the error of his ways, or maybe he was only bad because he was under a curse, and they break the curse, turning him good. Or maybe the pumpkin could bite him twice, so he shrinks down and gets chased by birds. That way his evil is stopped, but he isn't violently killed. I thought that's why they set up that was how pumpkins deal with monsters. And we even see the pumpkin bite him once. But no, he's collapsed on the ground, weak and poisoned, and it's like, finish him. And they tear down the curtains and annihilate him. You don't usually see straight-up execution in kids' movies. The lack of any blood doesn't change the fact that it's still violent, and the way he sprouts into foliage is pretty disgusting, with his head basically turning inside out as his eyes pour out of their sockets. I'm not sure it would even be that much more violent if one of the kids just pulled out a gun and shot him in the face. I mean, look at it. Look at it! It's grotesque! And if sunlight was lethal, why would your castle have windows in the first place? Why even take the chance with curtains? At the very least, it is definitely memorable. I don't think I'm going to forget Finkgrinder's death anytime soon. It's kind of awesome. And I actually like that it does subvert the trope of the bad guy turning good. Why turn him good when you can just murder him instead? I'm also really glad it avoids the auto-defenestration-inducingly mawkish trope of defeating him with the power of love. I do wish there was some kind of cheesy one-liner when they killed him, though. Why not, "It's curtains for you, Finkgrinder"? In fact, he already said it was curtains for that Thunderbelly.
But sadly, it's definitely curtains for that Thunderbelly.
So why not just move that line to Finkgrinder's death instead? Now that the kids have a taste for murder, it's time for our team of vigilantes to head back home. Though the skeletons and Ponce stay behind to explore the castle, which I guess they own now, so that's cool. Might want to do something about the rotting corpse, though.
It's going to be a happy Halloween. Thanks to you, Mr. Pumpkin.
Thanks to all of us.
Happy Halloween!
Time to rest. Happy Halloween!
And that's the movie. Happy Halloween, kids. But wouldn't it make a lot more sense if the dance competition was here at the end of the movie? As is, immediately after two of their party members are captured by the enemy, they take a break to have some fun at the ball, which doesn't make sense. They need to stop Finkgrinder's evil plot, and they have people to rescue. Sure, part of why they're there is to get advice from Rotundra, but why not change it so that at that point in the movie, they just get help from Rotundra, then after they defeat Finkgrinder, they go back to the pumpkin ball for the dance contest. That way it could be their victory celebration, rather than a bizarre interruption to their important quest. The end of the credits lists the copyright as 2002, so the 2006 on the back of the box must be for the DVD release itself. IMDb lists the year as 2000, but considering the lack of detailed info, and that it hasn't even gotten 5 ratings, I'm going to assume it's wrong and the real year is 2002, which does make more sense than 2006 in terms of the animation quality. Though it still doesn't excuse the exposure problems of the DVD transfer, as, again, 2006 is the year Blu-ray was released, so transferring movies to disc was not a new thing no one knew how to do. The movie is also shorter than I expected. That 70 minutes on the back is actually including the bonus cartoons. The movie itself is only 42. Speaking of the bonus cartoons, they are yet another way that this DVD manages to be surprising and confusing. I had assumed, looking at the packaging, that they were additional shorts made for the DVD release, probably starring the same characters. Turns out that's not at all what they are. A Haunting We Will Go and Boo Moon are Casper cartoons, as in actual Casper the Friendly Ghost, from 1949 and 53 respectively, and Cobweb Hotel is a short from 1936. I'm very confused by this, since to my knowledge none of these are old enough to be public domain. So, did they actually pay licensing fees to include them? Or have these become public domain through some means other than age? And including them at all is very strange. They're completely unrelated, besides a loose Halloween connection. As for the shorts themselves, the Casper ones you've probably either seen or heard of. Cobweb Hotel, on the other hand, I had never heard of, and it's genuinely interesting. You can find the whole short on YouTube, and it's worth watching. But back to the Dancing Pumpkin, it turns out that there is a second movie, released in late 2017, which is actually well after I found this DVD at that pawn shop. I didn't know this until after I started making this video. I haven't seen it, so I have no idea what it's like, but a quick look at the website shows that it's a remake, not a sequel. The synopsis makes it clear that they did make some changes, though. They mention that the Dancing Pumpkin is the leader of the pumpkins, which would explain why he's the one that goes on the quest, and it also says that a messenger tells him about Finkgrinder, where in the original he just has a flyer for some reason. It's possible the remake is much better, but I haven't watched it yet, as I've had quite enough of pumpkins for the time being. I also don't know how obscure this original truly is. I'd never heard of it. IMDb has no ratings and an incorrect year, but maybe more people know about it than I thought. Maybe there's already 100 reviews on YouTube, but I'm deliberately avoiding looking up if anyone else has reviewed it, so as not to influence this video. And if it sounds like I'm trashing the Dancing Pumpkin, keep in mind that this actually got funded and distributed, apparently won an award, and got a remake, which is far more than anything I've ever made has gotten. I'm just some upsettingly scrawny and pale asshat taking the piss out of it from a knackered old chair. Seriously, if you think this movie is weird, just be glad you haven't read any of my scripts. They are far weirder and infinitely dumber. In truth, I'm really glad I found this, and it was undoubtedly worth the $1 it cost. It's weird, bizarre, and frequently confusing, but I like weird and bizarre, so it's perfect. Ultimately, its purpose is to entertain, and I was definitely entertained. But while I found it amusing as a grown-ass adult who likes ludicrously weird things, would a kid like it? I don't know. I'm far too jaded and cynical to remember what it was even like being a child. Wait, that witch is still alive. Yeah, they didn't kill her, she's still at the bottom of that lake.
What happened to Gingley?
She sank straight to the bottom. She is now the witch of the lake.
They didn't do anything along the journey to stop the wedding, and it's definitely been more than 3 hours since that scene with the witch took place at night and they executed Fink Grinder with daylight, and made the whole journey back home. So it's official. They're married. All that kerfuffle about the 3-hour loophole in this movie still ends with a witch marrying a small child.